Opponents fight with bamboo swords over a meter long. The action can be lightning fast, with strikes landed in as little as 1/10 of a second. In a bout of Kendo, the first competitor to take 2 points is the winner. Points can only be scored with strikes to one of 4 designated target areas. These are to the men, or head, to the do, or torso, to the kote, or wrist, or a thrust to the throat, known as tsuki. Simply landing a blow is not enough for a point to count, however. Each strike must be executed with elegant posture and sufficient strength, and also use the correct part of the sword. In addition, the attacker must remain alert and composed after landing their blow. Only then is the point awarded. The majority of points are scored with one of the 3 striking blows, rather than the throat thrust. More than 2.5 million people are believed to practice Kendo worldwide. It's popular among men and women of all ages across many different nations. Kendo, however, is not the only form of Japanese sword fighting. Here we can see combatants using much shorter swords. These swords are wielded skillfully with just one hand. This sport is called Tankendo. At first glance, it looks similar to Kendo, but the speed of attack and defense is even faster. Tankendo is a minor martial art with only around 10,000 participants. But in recent years, it started receiving increasing international attention. On today's show, we take an in-depth look at the art of fighting with short swords and the advantages and history of these unique weapons.
Today, we've come to a dojo in Tokyo to learn about the unique martial art of Tankendo. Ooh, it looks like a real fierce fight. So Tankendo is similar to Kendo, but uses shorter swords, which forces the competitors closer together, making for intense and fast-paced matches.
Here to introduce us to Tankendo is Baptiste Tavernier from France, who's been practicing the sport for over a decade and holds a 6th dan. He's currently working as a member of Tankendo's International Committee, encouraging people around the world to take up the sport.
So you're holding one of the bamboo swords or shinai used in Tankendo, but how long is it?
Well, it has to be, by rule, 53 centimeters. So if you want to compare it with Kendo, you can see, Kendo is about maybe 1 meter and 20 centimeters or something like that, and you can see this is way shorter.
Tankendo swords are less than half the length of those used in Kendo. Weighing only 200 to 250 grams, they can easily be handled by women and children too.
It's much lighter than it looks.
Oh, yes.
I can easily hold it with one hand.
Oh, you could do it, yeah. Easily.
The sword's light weight allows for a one-handed fighting style. Just as in modern fencing, participants face each other side-on, making repeated thrusts. To score points, the thrust must strike one of 2 defined areas. either a dotsuki, or thrust to the torso, or a nodotsuki, or thrust to the throat. Just as in kendo, points are only scored if a blow is struck with appropriate posture, force, and composure. There are also two striking techniques, to the men, or head, and to the kote, or wrist. While in kendo, striking techniques are more common, in Tankendo, it's thrusts that account for more than 90% of attacks, as thrusting is the most efficient way to use a short sword.
A short sword means you really have to get up close, and that makes for a palpable sense of urgency during bouts.
You need to keep full concentration. The moment you relax, you'll be stabbed, so you really can't let your guard down.
Tankendo employs a variety of different thrusting techniques. Many of these techniques require the attacker to use their free left hand to grab their opponent's arm. This technique is called seitaizuki.
Here you can grapple, you can take his arm and then break his balance and then attack him.
And you are able to do that because you have your left hand available,
yes, exactly.
right?
That's why you only use it with one hand, because you have this one free. So that's what's kind of different from like kendo, where you cannot touch the opponent.
There are also techniques like this. Here the attacker uses both hands to push their opponent and knock them off balance.
Isn't it kind of nerve-wracking to be so close to your opponent?
Yeah, you have to be very nimble, very fast, so you don't really have time to think about anything. It's like, you have to go for the thrusting.
Skillful Tankendo requires the seamless combination of various different techniques. Let's take a step back to examine the roots of this intriguing martial art. Tankendo's origins lie with the bayonet, a blade attached to the end of a rifle. Bayonets were invented in Europe, and French-style bayonet techniques were first introduced to Japan in the 19th century. These techniques were influenced by fencing and relied on extending the front foot to thrust with the blade. The unfamiliar footwork proved challenging for Japanese soldiers to use in battle, however, and this led to the development of unique Japanese bayonet techniques. These new methods harnessed ancient Japanese techniques for brandishing the traditional spear, or yari. We asked historian Kozo Kaku about the advantages of fighting with a spear.
The spear is a very simple weapon. You just thrust to kill. Spears became widely used in warfare in Japan in and around the 14th century. People experimented with various techniques in battle, and by the 17th century, there was a wealth of different fighting styles. The best of these techniques were absorbed into Japanese bayonet fighting.
Bayonet fighting, with its focus on thrusting attacks, still played a major role in warfare in the early 20th century. Techniques continued to evolve as soldiers discovered ever more efficient ways to fight at close quarters.
You have the bayonet on the rifle, but eventually when you fight, you might need to fight at a closer range. So this is where people will use the bayonet in hand, dismounted from the rifle. So after the Russo-Japanese War in, 1906 or something, they say, oh, we need to devise something better for close-quarter combat.
Traditional techniques for fighting with a short samurai sword, or kodachi, were therefore incorporated into bayonet training.
Kodachi is the short.
The short samurai sword, right?
This is a kodachi.
Yes, a replica. I mean, a bukuto, or wooden kodachi, wooden sword. Again, you can see length is more or less the same.
The kodachi has a length of up to 60 centimeters, roughly the same as a tankendo sword. Samurai warriors always carried the short sword together with their iconic longer sword. Only samurai were allowed to carry these two swords together, which became a symbol of their status. Japanese martial arts expert Alex Bennett explains the role of the short sword.
When people entered someone's home, or for example, Edo Castle, they were not allowed to take their long swords with them inside. They had to leave them in a holder at the entrance. However, they were not required to remove their short sword. People kept the short sword in order to protect themselves. So they also had to really know how to use it.
Techniques for combat using the kodachi influenced the development of tankendo, and various styles of kodachi fighting, known as kodachi jutsu, are still used by martial arts schools across Japan today. The kodachi technique seen here involves attacking an opponent after pinning their arm. It's essentially identical to the seitaizuki technique we saw in tankendo. There are also techniques like this. Combat starts out with longer weapons. But the kodachi comes into play as the two combatants draw closer and the longer weapon is discarded. Just as with bayonet techniques, the weapon of choice depends on the distance between opponents.
With a longer weapon, it can sometimes become too long for the distance there is between you. And when that happens, it's easier to discard the weapon and go in for a closer attack. The shorter the weapon, the faster you have to attack. And if you're carrying a short sword, you draw it and attack with that.
Removing the bayonet from the rifle for close combat reflects this same principle and led to the distinct discipline of tankenjutsu as part of soldiers' training. The military's tankenjutsu then later evolved into the present-day sport of tankendo. As the tankendo sword is light and easy to use, the sport has recently been growing in popularity among women.
It's incredibly fast. It all happens in a flash, and that makes it so exciting.
The scope is quite broad. With kendo, you're only allowed to strike. But with tankendo, you can thrust with the sword and grab your opponent. It's fascinating.
So it's a mixture of a little bit of everything.
Exactly, yeah. So they just took whatever was the most efficient in each system to make their own system.
That makes the sport more attractive, right?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's interesting to study the history.
So So we've learned that a short sword is good for close quarters combat, but it can also be effective in defense. To find out more, we turn now to the sport of Kendo, which allows the use of a short sword for two-sword fighting.
One Japanese swordsman fundamental to any discussion of fighting with two swords is Miyamoto Musashi, who lived 400 years ago. Musashi, a frequent hero of comic books and novels, is said to have fought and won more than 60 battles. Experts say his greatest contribution to swordsmanship was to overturn the preconception that a fighter should only use one sword.
Musashi's approach was very rational. He thought that as warriors carried two swords, why should they only use one at a time? He came up with the idea of simply holding a sword in each hand. From a modern perspective, it's about making full use of your abilities and of your surrounding environment and the resources it has to offer.
The two-sword technique established by Musashi is today one of the officially accepted fighting styles under the rules of Kendo. Using two swords requires great technical skill, however, so practitioners of the technique are rare.
In addition, there's some prejudice against the two-sword approach. People think of single-sword Kendo as true Kendo. They don't really approve of using two swords. Also, as you strike with just one hand, you need a really clear, forceful contact for the judges to award a point. So these days, I think it's difficult for someone using two swords to win.
With a two-sword approach, it can be hard to score, as one-handed strikes are often judged to be too weak. One notable kendoka has been reversing this trend, however. This is Nobuyuki Yamana. In 2007, he entered the All-Japan Kendo Championships, making waves as the first exponent of Nito-Ryu to take part in 38 years. Yamana wins by striking the wrist guard. His powerful attacks change the image of two-sword fighting. Having retired from competition, Yamana now teaches children. After his kids' classes, he still practices Nito-Ryu. Although he says that he's lost 2/3 of his peak speed, he can still strike hard. Yamana spoke to us about the advantages of fighting with two swords.
Nito-Ryu allows you to attack and defend simultaneously. You can push back on your opponent's sword with one sword and strike with the other. Or you can block an attack to your mask while launching your own attack at the same time.
With standard Kendo, fighting with one sword, it's not possible to attack and defend at the same time. When you attack, you often need to push away your opponent's sword first. Blocking an opponent's attack before launching your own leads to a two-stage process. The special advantage of Nito-Ryu is being able to block with your short sword while simultaneously attacking with your long sword. The key issue, though, is generating enough force for the attack.
If you try to swing your sword with brute strength, it won't work. You need to harness the principle of leverage. That's why I hold the sword here. So as a lever, this is the fulcrum, the point of force and the point of action. When you get ready to strike, if you hold the sword too tightly, you won't be able to swing it. So you hold the sword lightly with half strength and only grip tightly at the instant you move in to strike. It's gripping firmly that moves the blade.
Forcing your opponent to focus on the short sword is also a good way of luring them into a trap.
There's actually some magic in the way it affects the distance with your opponent. It's completely different when you have the short sword. It makes it much easier to control the combat distance.
In standard kendo, opponents manage the distance between them by touching their sword tips together. The closer two opponents are, the easier it is for their swords to strike each other, so there's constant adjustment. With Nito-Ryu, it's the short sword that's held out in front. A single sword opponent, however, used to measuring distance through sword contact, continues to follow the same approach. A simple comparison shows how opponents find themselves drawn in closer to Yamana without realizing what's happening. Yamana subtly controls the distance between himself and his opponent, using small movements of his shoulders and elbows. If his opponent gets in too close, he immediately attacks them with his long sword. With their own sword blocked by Yamana's short sword, they can't easily counter.
The trick lies in adjusting the distance. If they concentrate on the short sword, then you bring the long sword down to attack. And if they're focused on looking upwards at the long sword, you can hold them with the short sword. They won't know where to look or how to attack. It confuses them. And an opponent who tries to attack while confused, if you use a feint like we did earlier, if they attack first, then they will lose.
A tremendous amount of practice is required to handle both swords at once. Yamana says that over the 20 years he's been using two swords, he's come to understand more deeply the importance of the short sword.
As it's easy to wield the short sword quickly, many people believe it's solely for defense and difficult to use for attack. But what I realized when I was in the Japan Championships and other major tournaments is that it's also for attack, and that if you don't use the short sword properly, you're left simply with the long sword held in one hand, which means losing half your power. For someone using two swords, the short sword is your lifeline.
These days, more people around the world are developing an interest in the short sword. This August, an international seminar on Tankendo was held in Japan for the very first time. 26 people from 13 different countries and regions took part, including the UK, Taiwan, and Malaysia.
You're trying to go too quickly, right? Going around. Yeah.
The participants were very keen to learn more about the techniques and spirit of Tankendo.
I want to get better myself, but I also want to spread that back in Canada for the sake of Tankendo in general, in an international level, but also for myself, because the more we are are practicing Tankendo, the more interesting it becomes.
So what are your hopes for the future of Tankendo?
Well, we hope to develop it more around the world for sure, and also to develop it more in Japan. This is really easy, you just put it in a bag. So it's really easy to, very convenient to go around.
Maybe I'll give it a try.
You're welcome.
Throughout history, short swords have been used in a wide variety of ways, whether on the battlefield or in self-defense. With strong roots in both Western and Japanese sword techniques, Tankendo is a unique and fascinating art that looks set to keep growing. As always, we conclude the show with Vision 2020, where we look at a specific aspect of the ongoing preparations for Tokyo 2020. So we'll see you again on the next J Arena.
With the 2020 Olympics kicking